Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here this morning. And yesterday we learned very much about Claus' work in the area of political philosophy, and he addressed the big questions of our times. But Claus was not only a great political philosopher, he was also speaking to very practical questions. He was also a sociologist addressing questions that are very close to social policy research. And that is what we are addressing today in our session on social policy and capitalism. And I would like to ask our panelist to the podium. That is David Abraham, Philippe van Parjis, Ilona Ostner, and our speaker, Anke Hassel. And let me first introduce our panelists to you. They are coming gradually. Where are they? Where's Philippe? Philippe, I saw you. You were here this morning. Where? Ah, here. Wonderful. Yeah, let me start chronologically with David. David Abraham is a historian, professor emeritus of law at the University of Miami, specialized in German history. He is widely known for his work on the collapse of the Weimar Republic, particularly for the distinctive way he linked political instability to welfare and social policy. Recently, he has engaged heavily with questions on citizenship in neoliberal times. And David, and he will say more about that in a minute, David met Claus in 1978 in Princeton during what he himself described as the heydays of neo-Marxist theory. Claus and David's path crossed several times again in Berlin, Bielefeld, Bremen, and Jena. And they remained closely interconnected since, engaging with all the important topics of our turbulent times, from the collapse to communism to the migration crisis. And thanks so much, David, for being here. Philippe van Parjis is professor of political philosophy at the University of Louvain in Belgium, and a leading figure in the debate on social justice, real freedom, and the future of the welfare state. Philippe's work has been central to the development of the idea of the basic income. Philippe, you also have known Claus since, I think, 1977, I wrote down, and Claus was very foundational for your first book on the evolutionary explanation in the social sciences. That was later then published, I think, in 1981, I wrote down. And in 1985, you organized a very important international conference back then on basic income in Louvain-la-Neuve, where you invited Claus, who, that is how you phrase it, he said it's attractive to come. That's, I think, in the email that he wrote to you, that it's an attractive idea. And the conference later led to the creation of the Basic Income European Network, where Claus served as co-chair in the beginnings. So the opinions on the question of basic income, as I can very much imagine, diverged, and it was heavily discussed. But it has become a central and important point of discussion with Claus on that topic. And of course, ever since, this is really a key debate point in social policy. So, Philippe, thanks very much for coming here. So, Ilona, one of my heroes of my youth, I must say. Ilona is a professor of public policy, was a professor emeritus of sociology, and a leading figure in gender studies, as well as welfare research at the University of Göttingen. I would definitely, and you would also call you a feminist, I think. not an old. I think you taught us how rigid, how verstaubt, I would say, Germany was in the 1980s. And you were really instrumental in bringing women and the gender perspective into comparative welfare state research. But I think what I've learned from you goes beyond that. Not only you helped establish Claus Offe's women's studies course in Bielefeld. That was really new to me. But what I also learned from what you sent me, that you're also engaged in very controversial ideas. The concept of Tauschringe, I don't even know how to translate that in English. Exchange circles, maybe, I don't know. That emerged while you were standing in front of the dishwasher and discussed that with Claus. So that's very interesting to hear. Thanks so much, Ilona, for being here. And I would like to introduce the speaker to you, Anke Hassel. She's a dear professor here at the Hertie School and professor of public policy. For many years, Anke and Claus were close colleagues here in Berlin. Their work intersected particularly on questions on social policy, including the debates on basic income and the broader purpose of welfare state in capitalist societies. Both have been concerned with social policies and why they exist, how they function, and whether social policies can survive under the economic and political pressure that we see today. So what is the legacy of Claus' thinking on social policy? And with that, I think I give you the floor to delve deeper into that question.
Thank you, Michaela, and I'm very pleased to be here. I feel very honored that I have the opportunity to speak here to you. I met Claus really first when we both started here at the Hertie School. We were both members of the founding faculty of the Hertie School, so about 20 years ago. And actually these days, being still at the Hertie School, I think of Claus quite often, and in particular of the earlier days when we had faculty retreats in Brandenburg, at Schloss Neuhardenburg, in Sizilienhof, etc., when we discussed, what would be the mission of such a school, what would the program look like, what would be the MPP, what would we teach, etc. And Claus was actually quite influential. And what was also already then present, what is actually the role of a private university, and how can a private university function with a private stakeholder, the Hertie Foundation, but still trying to operate as a university. For the foundation, even at the time, they thought we were a bunch of academics which they could not manage, which they could not control, which the foundation found really difficult from the very first day. And this relationship has not changed much. They still think of us, we are a bunch of academics which they cannot control us. I remember at one point there was the idea in the early days that all the faculty members should become key account managers, that we all would have key accounts with sort of certain ministries which we would have relations to, where we would place students, etc. And I remember talking to Claus about and his role as a key account manager, and he didn't really, obviously he thought this is a laughable idea, and he couldn't really, imagine what that would mean. And obviously he was a public intellectual at the school and not a key account manager. The second episode where sort of Claus was very influential for the school and very important was in a recruitment committee, I remember. And we were looking for a professor of democracy and comparative politics. And Michael Zürn is not here yet, so I can say that. So we had a bunch of people shortlisted, and the front runners were sort of rather, I would say, boring male academics with very standard careers within Germany, etc., doing very mainstream stuff. And we then had Alina Mungio-Pipidi entering the room. And I don't know who of you know Alina. Alina is also a public intellectual. She's a force of nature. She has a very strong presence in the room. And she broadened up our whole intellectual life towards Eastern Europe. She is from Romania. She experienced the revolution in Romania. She was a public figure even then. But there was a lot of resistance, from this sort of German environment. Can we really deal with such a figure, such as Alina Mungio-Pipidi? And Claus was the one who insisted that we hired her. And we had a lot of discussions about it. He was very stubborn. He could be very stubborn. And he, in the end, made sure that we would hire her. And for us, that changed the school. To have Alina here changed the school. It made us, take a different perspective on things. It made us much more international. And also it allowed us to have people who have their own agenda, who have their own public and intellectual trajectory, and showed that we can live with all sorts of people here. And that, I'm forever grateful for that also, because until then, the Hertie School was a very male faculty, a very male institution, and she also changed that. And finally, the third episode I sometimes think of now, and that was my last sort of main encounter with Claus, was a debate we had in the Wissenschaftskolleg on the basic income. As you know, and as we will hear, Claus was very engaged in promoting the idea of a basic income. And it was a real debate, so he was in favor, I was against. At the time, I was the research director of the German Trade Union Foundation, so I had a trade unionist perspective on the basic income, which, as you might know, is not positive, but rather negative on that. So we had a very heated debate, but we also had a very fair debate on this, and I can't remember who won this debate, but it was definitely a memorable thing. So these are my strongest memories of Claus. And we shouldn't underestimate what he meant for the school and the development of the school. In the following, I want to make only 3 remarks on what I think we can take from Claus's work on the research on social policy, the welfare state, and how to think about it. And the first observation I want to say is that the contribution of Claus to the research on welfare state is so foundational that we in the research community actually don't even see it anymore. So there are contributions to some intellectual discussions where you take certain things for granted, and you take them so for granted that you don't even question anymore where did they come from and what was their legacy and who was actually a main contributor to that debate. And Claus' contributions on the contradictions of welfare capitalism was actually one of these contributions, which is so obvious now in the entire debate that no one really sort of questions or even gives him credit for his contribution to that. He belonged to a generation of political sociologists who were shaped by the post-war experience of full-flown democratic capitalism at the time, and the first crisis it encountered at the late 1960s. And that is when the debate about, what is the contribution, what is the function of the welfare state actually about. And when I reread some of his work for this panel today, it reminded me, sort of so much to what we're discussing at the moment, because again, we are entering a crisis. The whole question is, what is the role of the welfare state in a particular crisis? But it also reminded me sort of his own intellectual legacy. And we had some sort of names already yesterday, but the main name that came to my mind when I reread it was actually Karl Polanyi. And the work of Karl Polanyi also already addressed, why are societies unstable? Why are capitalist societies unstable? What is the role of the welfare state? How to stabilize societies? And why is the welfare state a structurally necessary component in capitalist democracies? And his most influential articulation of this perspective is in the collection of essays, Contradictions of the Welfare State, but also in the subsequent contributions he made in books like Disorganized Capitalism and Modernity and the State. And I read him more as a sort of structuralist, developing a more structural theory of social policy that is still highly relevant of today. So what did he say? What was his main claim? And it is very straightforward. And as I said, this is what it makes so, that we think it's obvious, because his main claim is that social policy exists because capitalist economies and democratic societies generate incompatible demand on the state. And the state is operating under 2 competing comparatives. And the first one is that the state must support capital accumulation. The state must support the capitalist system it has. Economic growth, investment, profitability are essential for the state, for a capitalist state to function and to provide employment and tax revenues. But at the same time, the state must maintain democratic legitimacy. And democratic legitimacy comes from citizens demanding protection from the crisis that a capitalist system generates and generates periodically. And this then leads to unemployment, poverty, and inequality and social risk. So social policy emerges at the intersection of these pressures. And welfare institutions, as we know them, unemployment insurance, pension, health system, etc., they work as mechanisms that can stabilize capitalist societies by managing the social consequences of markets. And this produces a dilemma or paradox. Klaus liked dilemmas, or we can also call it a paradox. And the paradox is that on the one hand, the state depends on economic growth to finance social programs, but the very policies that protect workers can also constrain markets. And this is the back and forth movement we see all the time. We've seen them in most, or in all the OECD countries after the war, that we, on the one hand, we have policies that try to stimulate growth, and these are often liberalizing policies. These are often deregulating markets. We want market dynamics to generate growth and productivity. But then these growth generating policies introduce instability, and for the instability we have a response, and the response is the welfare state. And what the welfare state then does is to take back some of these neoliberal policies. So that is the dilemma. Interestingly, what he called the function of social policy at the time is deproletarianization. So a word which we don't use anymore, but it is really the policy that protects people from becoming impoverished and part of the proletariat. So the term refers to the degree to which individuals can maintain a livelihood independent of market participation. In later years, Gösta Esping-Andersen sort of replaced this term and used decommodification. It's also not a very good term because people don't really understand what decommodification is, but at least it's easier to pronounce. And, and everything that Esping-Andersen then sort of picked up in his 3 worlds of welfare capitalism really built on this notion of the function of social policy. So in pure market capitalism, labor is treated as a commodity. People have to survive by selling their labor. Social policy interrupts this mechanism and allows people to survive temporarily outside the labor market. That is decommodification. And that is, the core of this theory, which we all take for granted in welfare state research. So that is the first point. The implication is that in the political economy literature of the welfare state, which is still a vibrant research field and where I'm sort of belong to, and these contributions on the contradictions of the welfare state are still visible, and they are still visible in an ongoing debate, and that debate goes back to 30 years, is really to assess to what extent is the welfare state something that has to be fought against markets, so capitalists against markets, or whether it has to be, whether capitalists in themselves have an interest in the welfare state. So this whole notion about welfare states against or for markets is a core notion which we still argue about. If you go to these conferences, you still see people sort of arguing one side or the other. There's a long research literature, Walter Korpi, on power resource theory, who says, everything that has been achieved in the field of welfare and social policy had to be fought for by left-wing forces, either social democratic parties or trade unions, and it had to be fought against employers and capitalists because they try to stop any kind of welfare policy, social policy development from happening. But there's another side, and I'm more on the other side, who says actually social policy is essential to democratic capitalism, and you need a welfare state to make a capitalist economy work. And in that sense, it is also capital that has an interest in social policy. And it's also the employers who want social policy, and you have many examples in the history and the evolution of the welfare state where we can see that. that employers actually wanted the state to step in, wanted the state to regulate, to introduce the 8-hour day, to introduce social protection system, because it made their own system much more efficient if you know that there is a social protection system behind that, and if you sack people, that these people do not end in starvation. So, this debate, I'm only saying, 30 years on or 40 years on, this debate is still going on. And Klaus' work has been an early voice to take the economic function, not just the legitimacy function of the welfare state seriously. And in the current situation, where we still talk about, or where we now talk about low growth, high fiscal debt, and the increasing fisherization of work, this has important implications. So that is my first observation. The second observation is the notion of instability. So the relationship between the capitalist economy and the welfare state is inherently unstable. And I would say it is more complicated than that. It is more complicated than Klaus's analysis implied. So yesterday we already heard about the dilemmas and tensions. Welfare state is also exposed to these tensions. As I said, it has to stabilize capitalism on the one hand, but it also constrains capitalism. And as a result, there is always contestation. Yeah? How much can we liberalize the economy in order to induce growth? How much do we have to regulate the economy in order to protect people? And today we have lower growth that limits welfare expansion, and it even pushes governments to welfare cuts in order to give more stimulus to growth. But at the same time, we also have a higher demand for welfare. People feel more insecure. So at the time where less money is available, we have more demand by people. People want to be protected more because they see their life and their situation as inherently unstable. And that is the development that is reflected by what Klaus described, that markets generate insecurity, that triggers demands for regulation and protection. Regulation protection limits the room for growth, and that gives a way, again, to neoliberal policies. We can also use that insight to think through the potential for reform. What we know also from welfare state research is that welfare states usually do not shrink. Yeah? Even after decades of austerity, if we look at social spending hardly ever goes down. Yeah? It is either stable, goes down a little bit, but on the whole, if you look at the trajectory, the social spending as share of GDP in most OECD countries is actually going up and has been going up with each crisis. There has been more social spending and not less social spending. And that is because it is so deeply embedded in democratic expectation. Klaus has also already sort of foreseen the transformation of employment structures. So in disorganized capitalism, he described the new post-industrial societies, the weaker forces of industrial labor markets, fewer collective institutions, precarious employment, automation, fragmentation of careers, etc. He has already seen that. What we then see is that this tension then explains why we go back to neoliberalism. Even though we go back to neoliberalism, the welfare state was never dismantled. Yeah? We don't see that as an observation. Austerity hasn't taken place. But what we can see today is a different dynamic, and that is what I want to point out, is today we see that global capitalism has produced instances of instability that cannot be moderated anymore with social spending at the national state. Yeah? And that begins already with the stagflation in the 1970s, with then the period of low growth. Since the 70s, we had a short period of catch-up, mainly from the opening up of Eastern Europe and the rise of Asia in the 1990s. But then the latest from the global financial crisis in 2008, we have seen a very crisis-ridden development, and that has been on the global stage. And then, we had COVID. Again, we had a major disruption, and we had more demand for the welfare state. So what we can observe is that the instability of the global economy and the underlying geopolitical shifts is greater and more forceful than what the nation state can offer, and more forceful than what we can offer in order to accommodate these risks, these new risks. So national governments and international governance institutions cannot keep up with the volatility of the global capitalist market system. So this is one new challenge we have to take seriously when we want to understand where social policy is heading towards. Another aspect which we have to take into account is the changes in society. And I think Claus did not pay so much attention to that. But I think what we have seen in terms of the revolution of the role of women in society and in the labor market has fundamentally changed societies and has fundamentally changed also the role of the welfare state. Female empowerment of women, their claim for equal rights, meant that many of the protective institutions which were located in the family home have been dismantled and are not available anymore as a free product, a free service to societies. Yeah? Many of the mature welfare states have taken it for granted that women deliver social protection without any reward and without sort of being even mentioned in the sort of institutional setup of the welfare state. This has fundamentally changed. As soon as women enter the labor market full-time and not just as a part-time addition to a male breadwinner model, to the male breadwinner model, we have a new setup. And this is a sort of liberalization from within. So we're not just talking about sort of neoliberal reform agenda in a geopolitically much more unstable world. We are also talking about a much more unstable society from within because women do not perform the functions that they used to have in the old welfare state. So this is a role which we don't see so much, but which I think we need to take into account when we move to, what is the welfare state of today. And the third aspect, which we also need to talk about, is the fundamentally new role of social risk and the shift from old social risk to new social risk. And that is also a later development, which Claus did not really contribute to so much. And it is also related to the modern society. So old social risks are very clear. That is why the welfare state was founded. We have an employment risk and we have non-employment insurance. We have an old age risk and we have a pension system. We have a health risk and we have a health insurance. So these are the old social risks. And these old social risks were risk of poverty. Yeah? And these social protection schemes were there because you want to avoid that people become poor because they grow old, etc. Today, the risk of poverty affects other groups of people. It does not affect the older generation so much. It does not affect people who fall sick, etc. Today's new social risks are allocated with identities of societal groups. And these societal groups are lone parents. Lone parents have the highest risk of poverty in modern societies today. And the other two groups, which very high poverty risk, are either young people, the young generation has a much higher risk of poverty today, and migrant communities. Yeah, so it is not so much related to their employment status anymore. It's not so much related to the life course, but it is really related to status in societies. So self-employed, lone parents, young people, and migrant communities are the ones who are most affected by poverty. And this is another challenge where we have to think about how to deal with that. And then I come to my third observation, and the third observation is the basic income, because the basic income is seen and was seen by Claus as a solution both to the tensions between capitalist societies and the welfare state, but also very practically, a very practical proposal and a radical answer to these increasing dilemmas, how the welfare state changes, how modern society changes, is just to give everyone a basic income. And I don't have to say too much about it because I'm also out of time, but it is clear, the basic income decouples income from employment, very obvious. You get an income without working. It extends decommodification. You can discuss decommodification in a very different way. It has a very simple administrative structure because the welfare state, one of the problems of the welfare state, it has just become too complicated in many countries to calculate who deserves what. So, you have a very simple administrative structure, and it supports democratic participation because people can opt in and out of employment, and then they can choose to what extent they participate. So basic income in Claus' perspective strengthens the social foundations of democracy. And it's a beautiful proposal because it's so elegant and simple. In my view, it obviously, it raises as many questions as it answers, and I just want to mention a couple, and then I leave the rest to the panelists. But it obviously raises the question of work. You know, work is at the heart of modern societies. It's also at the heart of the welfare state. It is absolutely not clear what automation, AI, new technology will mean for the future of work. What we now see is the automation of white-collar professions through AI, but whether that means that work will dry up, I'm very skeptical. I think the demand for personal service work will further increase. We will have a vibrant labor market also in the future. And as long as this is the case, I would always opt for good work rather than a free income. So, and we need to take the issue of work and how to design and how to regulate work very seriously. The second aspect I want to just briefly highlight is that our societies are built on reciprocity, and the welfare state is built on reciprocity. That you're in a relationship with others, that you contribute something, and therefore you're also rewarded with something. The basic income, you know, and reciprocity does not have to be based on the exchange of money, but the exchange of money helps. Yeah, and to have a clear also financial relationship between different members of society makes it much easier to account for reciprocity in society. And a basic income has a huge effect on sort of the basis of reciprocity within our societies. And the third aspect is really about the political economy of the basic income. I think the basic income does not take into account how capitalism really works. What is the role of wages, the wage nexus within capitalist societies? It will basically turn this income into a basic subsidy of firms, because firms will take the subsidy for themselves. And what will happen is that wages will drop, and we will not have really a reward system for effort at work, but it is, you know, it will contribute to the monopolization, to oligarchic markets, which we already see with the tech companies, etc. And it is not a surprise that the tech industry is very much in favor of a basic income, because it feeds into their system. So I think the political economy of the basic income is just wrong. But again, that we can discuss if we want to in our panel. So I've taken up too much time. I want to leave it here. I just want to reiterate, you know, his work is so foundational that we, you know, in the welfare state research, we cannot get past him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anke. Before we dive deeper into the basic income and also into decommodification, let's go back a little bit in time. And I would ask David first on the podium to take us a little bit, not only back in time in terms of theory, but also in terms of relationship with Klaus.
Thank you very much. So I'd like, first of all, to thank those who've set up this wonderful occasion to honor Klaus's scholarship for inviting me to participate. It's a real honor. I would like to take my time to say a bit more about my own relationship to Klaus, in part because I think that marks his own trajectory to a certain extent. And then I would like to bring him back to the Marxist orbit where I do believe he belongs in the end. So I first, and Anke has just covered so much territory that I'm afraid there will perhaps be a little simple-minded repetition of some of what you said, but I will try in the end, at least, coming from the US, to be a little bit less optimistic about the necessary complicity of capital in the welfare state. At any rate, so I met Klaus in 1978 when I was a brand new assistant professor at Princeton University, and he was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies. I had written a dissertation on Weimar Germany, and in it, Klaus's soon-to-be classic Strukturprobleme des kapitalistischen Staats had provided a major framework. Those were the heydays of neo-Marxist theory, and we all spent many hours excitedly debating key issues. Volume after volume would come out from Surkamp or New Left books, and this was the delight of every graduate student at the time, to pour through these books. And as was to be true for the 45 years following, Claus was the most insightful and sympathetic critic, always positive, even when his fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies that year, Michael Sturmer, would not let his children play with Klaus's and Sabina's children because he was a supporter of terrorists. Claus, that is, was deemed a supporter of terrorists. And for me, Claus was always someone to learn from. Claus returned to the neighborhood as the Heuss professor at the New School in 1980-81. The world had changed a bit already. Thatcherism had begun, the Berufsverbot, blacklisting had accelerated, and there was, some of you may remember, the Bubach-Nachruf affair, which led Claus to have some difficulties at Bielefeld. But Claus performed more than admirably as what today we would call a public intellectual, and he worked to create a solidarity across disciplines and across oceans. I personally experienced incredible generosity from him during my own professional travails. And on top of that, he helped to deepen my understanding of social democracy's constraints in his work, Disorganized Capitalism, providing analyses which, together with those of another mentor of mine, Adam Przeworski, are now being rediscovered by a new generation of students of capitalist democracy. At the time of Klaus's passing, the journal Jacobin, which is the voice of a younger generation of democratic socialists in the English-speaking world, devoted a very long piece, in particular to the piece he did with Helmut Wiesenthal on the two logics of collective action, which will remain a classic not only of political sociology, but also of political engagement. And those of you who have missed that essay for one reason or other should go back and read it. So Claus, as we know, subsequently saw and acted on a future for the left in the Greens, whose anti-imperialism and environmentalism were of the day. The anti-imperialism seems to have gone away, but the environmentalism is still there. And Claus, of course, had his own qualms with the trajectory of the Green Party thereafter. Despite his own initial post-'89 enthusiasm and the good fortune of meeting Ulrike, Klaus's discovery, together with that of our mutual great friend Ulrich Preuss, of the tunnel at the end of the light, provided a counterweight to the triumphalism which marked most, certainly, English language, but I think in general far broader view of what the demise of the Soviet Union meant. I saw Claus often in the decades that followed. Let me move to some of our last discussions. The question of immigration and the irrational, let us call it irrational, component of social cohesion and social identity was one that he and I struggled with a bit after 2015, 2016. And I think what we concluded is that both abstract constitutional principles and concrete historical and cultural experience are necessary to maintain the solidarity, even in a diverse society, the solidarity that is necessary for redistribution to take place peacefully in the society. And it's in that context that I take some pride that I was able to effect a bit of a reconciliation between Claus and his somewhat truculent student, Wolfgang Streck, whom he also on occasion describes as his smartest student ever, but nonetheless one who does not share Klaus's gentility, at least rhetorically. As Claus became increasingly disabled the last months, it was nevertheless clear that his intellectual powers and personal indomitability had not receded even a bit. topics as painful and personal for us both as Germans and Jews, the war in Gaza, anti-Semitism, the demise of the America he once so treasured. All of those things were matters in which he could still bring both his human sympathies and his keen analysis. And even this past September, as he was failing, I continued to learn from and with him in every scientific and human way. Let me now go back a bit to the 70s. So then and now, there are three fundamental visions of the relationship between capitalism and democracy. Conservatives, of course, think that capitalism is the best environment for democracy, that choice is the central principle of public life, etc. There are lots of people who believe that. It's probably less true in this room, but certainly a lot of people believe that. The second is that the relationship is always indeterminate. The inequality of market outcomes in capitalism and the putative equality of all persons in a democracy may or may not coexist in reality depending on the circumstances. That cannot be generalized. This is essentially the social democratic view, and Klaus had one foot in that camp. The third view is that capitalism and liberal democracy stand in contradiction to each other because the relationship of inequality to equality is not really indeterminate. One has to give way to the other. Any equilibrium can only be temporary and unstable. Klaus generally stood with his other foot in that third view, and psychologically, I think he ultimately was in that third view, though the corpus of his work is located mostly in the second view. So I won't go through, for time's sake, I won't go through an analysis that we here are all familiar with, and which summarized very nicely in an article by Wolfgang Merkel on the ongoing relationships between capitalism and democracy. Klaus's work, his analysis, very much took place at the pre-1990 work, when he turned his attention, I think not accidentally, a bit away from the welfare state, in part because the work was lodged in the Trente Glorieuses. The work was lodged in the period when, because of the reconstruction that Piketty and others have described, because of labor's strong position after World War II, the need for reconstruction, unionization, the destruction wrought by fascism, etc., that introduced a period in which it was possible to have a capitalist and democratic union around the welfare state, and that system endured and created something called social democracy as a historical phenomenon. Social democracy's adoption of Keynesian capitalism in place of socialism, beginning perhaps with Bad Godesberg, but thoroughly in any event, that created a system, again, described extremely well by Adam Przeworski in a classic New Left Review article entitled Social Democracy as a Historical Phenomenon, which also rests in good part on Klaus's work. That ended, has ended. It is true, as Anke pointed out, that social spending did not suddenly disappear. In the case of the United States, however, if you disaggregate that and remove pensions, remove payments for older people, the fact is that there has been and is an ongoing assault to roll back that social democratic regime whose contradictions Klaus so ably analyzed for several decades. It must also be acknowledged, as painful as it might be, that the existence of the Soviet Union, whatever the problems of the people who lived in it and around it, that its existence served as another pillar on which labor in the West could rely to push capital to make various concessions. And the end of the Soviet Union, not accidentally, coincides also with the accelerated assault on the welfare state. That is not to be construed as a defense of the Soviet Union. Slowly but steadily, since the fiscal crises of the 70s and the failure of labor to move forward, Eric Hobsbawm's famous statement about the forward march of labor halted, right? The fact that the Meidner Plan, for example, which would have been the next step in a social democratic advance, just did not happen, was stopped, stultified. The fact that there was no forward movement enabled backward movement to take place, and that, particularly in the U.S., is what we have experienced. The turn toward deregulation and globalization, the rise of financialization, things that Anke already mentioned much more effectively than I'm about to, contributed to these changes significantly. The global financial crisis since 2008 intensified the critical elements of the new divergences, accelerated the race to the bottom. The period that began with Clinton, Blair, and Schroeder really has not stopped. What has happened, however, in that period is that capital itself has changed. That is to say, the industrial economy, which worked in toleration with and sometimes in conjunction with trade unions, was replaced both financial and now high-tech economy, which has no such inclination. But nonetheless, we live in electoral democracies, so it is important to build constituencies. It is important for elites to build constituencies. Now I will shift. What I'm about to say is more specific to the US than to Europe. But what the Trumpists discovered is that the straightforward conservative free market agenda a la Reagan, Thatcher is no longer marketable to the electoral masses. And so we have seen in the US the MAGA movement, based on, those of you who may remember Theodore Geiger's famous essay in the early 30s, Panic in Mittelstand, has built on the panic in certain parts of the US Mittelstand, based around ideological struggles, DEI, feminism, too many advantages for black people, and so weiter and so forth, has built on that to establish a substitute electoral base to replace the more social democratic base in the working class and professional middle class in the United States. The new dominant fractions of capital come from several parts of the capitalist structure. Silicon Valley, they want a regulation-free state in which they can perpetually innovate and use AI to eliminate workers while themselves becoming unimaginably wealthy. Hedge fund operators who have so far cashed in on the deconstruction of the industrial economy, buying and selling bits and pieces of it. Residual enemies of the administrative state, going back to the 1930s for that matter. And their goal to destroy what's left of both environmentalist measures and trade unionism. They have displaced the more welfarist, tolerant capitalists of the industrial era and the public sector adjacent realms. So people like Thiel, Ellison, Musk, Ackman, Zuckerberg, Andreessen, and others have come to believe that only they and their alliance with Trump can hold back an enemy that is both decay. 1 minute will do it. that represents both decay and revolution. And now I will go out a little bit on a limb. In the 1920s and 30s, it was Jews who represented both decay and revolution. And now, for these people, decay and revolution is what the world of DEI and progressivism and wokeism was both. You can see it in Trump's cabinet ministers. The simultaneous attack on them is both decay, people who decay the society, but also revolutionize the society. So they are the current scapegoats for reconsolidating a popular base for support of the new fractions within capital who have ascended as the social democratic world, of which Claus was perhaps the most able analyst, has receded into the rear view mirror. And on that optimistic note, I will stop.
Thank you so much, David, for taking us back into time in terms of Claus history, but also then bringing us back into contemporary challenges that we face. We are now moving to a very practical, more practical social policy suggestion that Claus very much brought into the picture. And I give the word to Philippe. And Philippe also brought some pictures with us where we see actually where these ideas emerged. And yeah, I give the word to Philippe, who explains more about these pictures.
I first saw Claus. I listened to him. I watched him in Bielefeld during the semester I spent there in 1977. But I didn't say I met him there because I didn't speak to him even once before the end of my stay there. Not his fault. It was my fault. Too shy. The real beginning of my relationship with Claus came a number of years later. But I should say that nonetheless, this first contact had some impact, to which Michaela briefly referred, because whereas I found Luhmann's writings really useless, not worth the big trouble of trying to read them, instead I found Claus's writings very useful, very helpful. And indeed, I used two of his early articles in one of the chapters of my Oxford doctorate, which also became my first book, Evolutionary Explanation in Social Sciences, because I found it the best way of, I found in his writing the best way of making sense, of making as much sense of as was possible of so-called functionalist Marxism, that is, an attempt to explain social institutions, to explain social policies by their objective functions, irrespective of the intentions of the actors. But, as I just said, my real relationship with Claus only started a few years later, when at the end of December 1984, I wrote to him to ask him to send to me a piece I saw he was about to present at a conference in Maastricht, a piece co-authored with two of his assistants, including Helmut Wiesenthal, to whom reference has already been made. I don't know whether he's still here today. And the title of this paper was "The Crisis of the Welfare State and Alternative Modes of Work Redistribution." And this piece ended with a plea for, I quote, citizen rights to income financed through general taxation, in order to, the intention of which would be, I quote, to provide people with the minimal means of subsistence outside formal employment, and hence to escape the dictates of the labor market. A plea which I found restated quite energetically in a little article I found by chance in a publication based in Rome called Development. It was a piece by Claus under the title, "He who doesn't work should nevertheless eat." Wow, I thought, here is at long last a major scholar who seems to be attracted to that very simple but weird idea that had come to me out of the blue 2 years earlier and struck me as a very promising way forward in an ideologically disillusioned, technologically turbulent, and ecologically threatened world. And I therefore, as Michaela mentioned, invited him to a conference in Louvain-la-Neuve in September 1986 around that idea that I then called basic income. I called the conference first International Conference on Basic Income. I used basic income inspired by the Dutch use of basisinkomen. In England at the time, it was called social dividend. In the US, it was called demogrant. And this is indeed the conference at which BIEN was born, the Basic Income European Network, with Claus as one of its two co-chairs, a position later held by Ilona. Claus subsequently remained a very assiduous member of that network, including after the network became a worldwide network in 2004, and he even organized one of its congresses here in Berlin at the Wissenschaftszentrum in 2000. Within the basic income movement, I've always felt Claus and Claus's active presence as immensely valuable. Not only because, like for many others, our shared values and our shared analysis had led us to draw similar policy conclusions, but also because of shared attitude of vigilance against dogmatism and sectarianism to which this sort of movement can easily fall prey. Perhaps this attitude could be called social science for a better world. Adopting this attitude has a number of implications. One, obviously, it means maintaining friendships with even the staunchest opponents of basic income. For example, our common longtime friend, Jon Elster. Two, it also means making sure that critical voices are being heard at our congresses. Fritz Schaub, for example, was one of the keynote speakers at a congress that took place in Amsterdam. Three, it means also paying attention to what can be learned from experiments, especially those few randomized control trials, despite their many limitations, and of course bearing in mind these limitations, including when their results are judged disappointing by some of the basic income supporters, as was the case, for example, with the experiment set up by OpenAI and Sam Altman in 2 American states between 2020 and 2023. 4, this attitude further means refusing purism, refusing a position that consists in saying either we must have real unconditional basic income, that means strictly individual, no means tested, no work test, and at a level that is sufficient for a person to be beyond the poverty level, even if that person lives alone, or nothing, or we don't want it. That's a puristic attitude, which is sometimes represented in the basic income movement. We certainly don't share that attitude, and we shouldn't just dismiss as a matter of principle, for example, something that would take the form of a refundable tax credit, individual tax credit, instead of a cash payment. We shouldn't dismiss out of hand UBI well below the poverty level for a single person, but of course, without abolishing the whole of social assistance, let alone social insurance at the same time. We shouldn't dismiss household-based basic income that would be obligation-free and universal, but not strictly individual. We shouldn't dismiss a participation income, one that would be individual and universal, but with some obligation of participation, as proposed, for example, by Tony Atkinson. We shouldn't dismiss an unconditional basic capital given to young adults. This is an idea which Claus has always found more attractive than I have ever done, particularly in the form that was proposed 1999 by our common friend Bruce Ackerman, but even just a few months before Claus died, he forwarded a message by an American who proposed a birthright bond, which was yet another version of that proposal, less inegalitarian than the Trump accounts, which have partly the same format. So all these proposals are worth considering, and in this attitude which I've been sharing with Claus all along, all these proposals, more modest proposals, are worth considering both as improvements in themselves and as possible steps to more radical, to more ambitious policies. Finally, this attitude also means emphasizing that in order to produce its desirable effects, a basic income must operate in conjunction with other institutions. Obviously, universal public services and facilities, for which a basic income is not a substitute but a complement, but also, according to Claus, in conjunction with infrastructure and also some funding that makes it possible, that encourages what he called organisierte Eigenarbeit. It's fine with me, but I must say that what I find the most important complementary institution is rather lifelong learning. We need a revolutionization of post-obligatory education, possibly with a shrinking of the initial period, in order to develop massively lifelong learning, precisely because, and here I'm on Anke's side, because work, and meaning paid work, is important for many, if not for most, if not all people. Not full-time, not for the whole career. And lifelong learning, given the technological context, is an absolute complement to a basic income. And basic income is a facilitator of lifelong learning because it enables you more easily to reduce your working time or to interrupt your career. So the sharing of this attitude, so maybe it can be called social science for a better world, has been at the core of 4 decades of unforgettable intellectual and activist comradeship with Claus. But our exchanges were not only about UBI. I have, like him, and as we saw illustrated already so far, many other interests and many other causes which we want to defend apart from a basic income. I read, for example, his Europe Entrapped, his book on the European Union, particularly the Euro crisis, and found it a paradigmatic example of the sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach which many public issues require, that articulate insights from economics, from law, insights and information from economics, from law, from philosophy, in addition to sociology and political science. While I'm finishing here. While I largely agreed with Klaus on the European Union, there is, on the importance of the European Union and the challenges of the European Union, I did not on another issue, another theme, which we also discussed in the last few years. Namely, the war in Ukraine, a topic on which I rather aligned with the view of the person who Klaus described as his mentor, Jürgen Habermas, as these views, Habermas's views were expressed, among other places, in his Plädoyer für Unterhandlungen, published in the Süddeutsche Zeitung in February 2023. Klaus sent me, as he probably did to many of you, a long letter, in this case on this topic, and containing a long argument against this view. And in my response, that will be my lead to my punchline, I said that what I read there was, I quote my response, in characteristically of a mode. And what did that mean? It meant, I quote again, no nonsense. Dorothée and Eric Wright would have said no bullshit, no nonsense, lucid, honest, and articulating the main considerations in a compact way that makes it possible to get a strong intellectual grip on the key issues. One good thing about people like Klaus, who wrote books and articles and letters, is that even after they are gone, they can still teach us, inspire us, make us believe, even in the darkest times, that a better world is possible, and give us thereby the courage to fight for it.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for taking us deep into Klaus' work, and also, we can actually keep the picture. We can go back and into also the basic income, and we are moving to decommodification, and with Ilona. Actually, Ilona is on that picture where she's discussing in a group of men. I just realized, I didn't actually realize that they are all men before Ilona told me. There's one woman. Discussing basic income, and Ilona, the floor is all yours, moving us into a little bit of a different direction in terms of actually how gender plays in here.
Thank you so much for your invitation. It's a great honor for me to be here. And thanks to Anke for introducing decommodification, which, as you all know, is a key concept, a heuristic tool, and a normative measure in Esping-Andersen's comparative welfare state analysis. Evaluating welfare states while sitting in Stockholm. It's all of said. Klaus, in contrast to Esping-Andersen, stressed the centrality of commodification long before him, during the 80s, not decommodification, and Klaus stressed the dynamic interrelations between commodification, decommodification, and recommodification, and of politics both against and for markets. Decommodification presupposes full active commodification, as is the case to a large extent in the Scandinavian welfare states. Employment comes first, employment for all and of all, women included. In the following, I briefly talk about my personal encounters with Klaus and lessons learned also around what could be just gender policies. I met Klaus first in person in the early 80s when I was asked by him and Johannes Berger to discuss content and structure of a women's, not yet gender studies course in sociology at the university of Bielefeld. Why me? Then I belong to the less radical, less frightening wing of young sociologists who had just managed, against all odds, to establish a women's studies section in the German Sociological Association, and also, frightening, some affirmative action measures. During this time, I really remembered vividly sitting in Offe's family kitchen and Klaus reflecting on new policy mixes to support the emerging new non-market and non-state alternative services for households, citizens on the local level. Here the Tauschringe come into play. You don't know what a Tauschring is? Okay. These new mixed policies should, now thoughtful vision of Klaus, I like the concept, combine the good sides of market, state, or family need provisions, their respective provision of freedom, equality, and altruism, while minimizing their bad sides. Basic income became, at that time already, one element in the new mixed economy of welfare. I come to this back later. Klaus was well aware then, in our discussions, and now I use Nancy Fraser's word, of the liberating effects of employment, especially for women. While employment subordinates women under the boss's command, the employment sphere simultaneously is a limited sphere. The boss has no direct command outside the employment sphere. This outside includes consumer markets and the non-commodified domestic sphere where mostly women work unpaid. The wage functions as a resource and a source of leverage for women. For some women, the wage buys a reduction in the vulnerability which comes with marriage. It gives voice to women and exit options. Klaus knew this, but he still saw solutions and women's place in a sort of formalized informal economy and the basic income. I learned from Klaus a lot, especially and extremely helpfully for my own chaotic thinking, how to organize social phenomena, how to reduce the complexity by applying 4-sector models. Vierfelder-Schemata. I don't know what the proper translation is. Four-sector models. In such a 4-sector model, Klaus was able to put the family as a, particularistic, solidaristic unit. So he had family, market, state, and public sphere, and he had particularism, universalism, and egoism, and altruism. And the family was, of course, in his view, and Hegel's too, particularistically altruistic versus the market, who was universally egoistic, versus, and so on. I really liked it. It was so helpful for me and my students to talk about the family. And coming back to commodification and decommodification, also Klaus developed this very interesting Vierfelder schema, fourfold sector model. You have inclusion in the labor market, exclusion from the labor market on the individual and the institutional level, and you have negative and positive measures. And this model we use to, compare now in a feminist way, welfare states. We used positive and negative familiarization, positive, negative defamiliation, and Jane and I, by this, arrived to strong, moderate, and weak breadwinner models. I will stop here with a brief remark to basic income in a feminist, gender-just perspective. Background of class writings of the crisis and future of the labor market was what Mückenberger called the erosion of the standard employment and the increase of atypical wage work. As feminists, we put this diagnosis topsy-turvy and spoke of the evident erosion, you spoke about it, of standard family and above all, erosion of the family wage. So Offe and many feminists alike looked for emancipatory politics suited for these new risks and in the field of employment and reproduction. Policies that would give old and new vulnerable groups voice and exit options. And again, basic income appeared at first as such a policy, but only if basic income was constructed from the point of view of gender justice and within an altered gender order. And so during a Bien conference, I guess it was in London, I don't remember exactly, I presented Nancy Fraser's 7 still valid principles of a just gender order promoted by perhaps a basic income. Such a principle is first, basic income should prevent poverty. It should prevent exploitation by abusive husbands, bosses, or pimps. It should create income equality in the sense of all offs, which means income for women who are not solo women, but lone mothers. It should provide the same leisure time. It should provide equality of respect and anti-marginalization. If a basic income marginalizes women within the household, it's not a just gender policy. And it should, above all, anti-androcentric. It should not be a full breadwinner model focusing only on employment. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ilona, for bringing gender into the picture and also weaving in actually how Claus really much influenced comparative welfare state research also in this respect. That was also for me very interesting to learn. We don't have much time for questions, but a short round if there are. We start, was it, I think Alexander, right? Is that correct? I know I'm learning.
Thank you very much. Test. Okay, that's too loud. Isn't it possible to see the social basic income neither as something capitalistic nor socialist, but something very rational, as robotics and artificial intelligence are going to substitute most of the jobs and money can be saved by that?
Maybe to Doro, it's just behind you. Okay, and then Laszlo.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a super interesting panel. I have a question just because you all went back to the 1970s and 80s. Did the Wages for Housework campaign play a role in any of these debates? And if so, how did it come in? Thanks.
Laszlo is over there. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So Philippe, and to the general panel, actually, it's not a question, it's just a proud Hungarian. But on this basic income idea, one of the forerunners of this idea was Tibor Liska, a Hungarian economist, who was thinking already in the 70s, 80s about personal social capital, social inheritance, some alternative both to capitalism and state socialism. And he was the only economist, I think, in the world who was loved both by communists and by capitalists. So this, there was a special issue in Economist about his views, and then the Italian Communist Party really loved him.
Yeah, maybe we start with a third question. Maybe Philippe, I'm sure you want to take. Shall we take one more question, and then I have to write down, and then we have to close the panel. But there will be time for discussion during the break.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the conversation on the gender aspect of welfare and the basic income. I had a number of conversations with Klaus on the issues, particularly in the United States, when women suffer even a great deal when they are single mothers, no equal rights amendment, no socialized childcare, and the Democrats have not been completely overlooked the questions of the family, and as a result, that has been recaptured by the conservative. And so at the cornerstones, to some extent, of right-wing populism is this issues of women who have to just come back to the household, the triad wives, etc. So I think it's, can you just speak to this comparative aspect, particularly within the United States and Europe?
Thank you. Maybe we start with the basic income question. Shall we start there? Maybe Philippe, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, well, all four of them are related to So I'll reply telegraphically and so very elliptically. One, basic income and as a substitute for the right to work, I'm totally against that. That is, I don't buy at all the Elon Musk view about basic income, that there will be all these jobless people, you can't let them starve, you don't want to make them revolt, so just give them. No. Basic income, because it's a floor and because it has to be associated with lifelong learning, is a way of giving access, keeping an access to meaningful job for the majority of the people. That's what it has to be, but it can't do it on its own. And one of the other ingredients, there are many more, including universal services, is lifelong learning. Two, the wage, homemakers, where is Dorothy? Yeah. Okay. Yes, that played a role. For example, there is a philosopher, German philosopher, who is now at the University of Basel, I think, called Angelika Krebs, who organized a symposium on basic income, and her own piece was called Why Mothers Should Be Fed. It was an allusion to one piece I had written under the title, Why Sturfeld Should Be Fed. And there she argued in favor of a sort of homework-related wage as an alternative to basic income. I'm strongly against it because it traps women in that situation of a homemaker, because they lose it if they start working part-time, etc. No, it should be an unconditional income, which you then top up when you go and work. Three, Tibor Liska, yes, it played some role in the very early discussion on basic income. In particular, there was one of the co-chairs of Bien, who Ilona will remember, Erwin Morley-Fletcher, who had direct contact with him, and so, but it didn't play much of a role because his ideas around basic income remained pretty vague, but it was roughly in the same vein. And then, finally, I should quickly say something on that because it's also close to, I find it very important issue. I remember one conversation I had with Jim Tobin, known for the Tobin tax, etc. He was professor at Yale, and I was visiting professor there in 1990. And 1997, and there he was one of the promoters of a basic income under McGovern, and it failed, and then, but there were these experiments, negative income tax experiments, not quite a basic income, but something along that line, and then he said, well, there were these results, and the main political proponent, Moynihan, when it came to the Senate, said, look, we have the results, science has proved that it's a bad idea. But Tobin said, but in what sense a bad idea? The two main results was a slight decrease in the labor market participation of secondary earners, that is mostly women with children, and two, an increase in the divorce rate. And he said, what's bad with that? A number of women chucked their impossible partner because of the greater autonomy. That should be seen as a good thing. It was seen as a bad thing because then there are more kids growing up without a father at home. But he said that's part of emancipation. And two, there was some decrease in labor market participation by women, if only temporary. So there is. And he said, well, who are we to decide what's best for these women? When it's possible for them to lighten the double shift and have a more livable life thanks to the autonomy. Any form of basic income, however, whatever the level, however you fund it, will mean a redistribution of income from men to women, giving them more freedom to choose, at least the women at the bottom. At the bottom part of society. And that's why Claus, like I, remained also on feminist grounds in favor of a basic income, but not on its own, not on its own. There are other things that are...
We have to watch a little bit the time. I think it just connects very perfectly to Ilona, and then I would briefly give also to David very quickly on a historical perspective, and then for Anke on the last final concluding statement, but please be aware of the time because there's coffee waiting for us. It gets cold. But I think, Ilona, you told me yesterday actually to reminded me of the Durkheim quotation that marriage kills. No, what was it again?
According to Durkheim, suicide rates are higher for married women and lone men. This is why Durkheim is very much in favor of strict divorce law. Divorce should be followed. The social order is, will be attacked when women get a divorce. So, and men are more suicidal when they are on their own, especially when they are aging, which is true, as you know, as a demographer. Okay. In fact, German feminist movement started with a debate on wages for housework, and it was my socialist tradition. And we all saw the film by Lisa Wertmüller. I don't know who knows the film Tutto a posto e niente in ordine, which means alles ist in Ordnung, alle sind auf ihrem Platz, aber nichts ist in Ordnung. It's a film about Sicilian migrant workers living in Milan. And women now demand from the industrial workers, from city mayor, a wage for ironing, cooking, and so on. It's a sort of strike within the household. And I was very impressed by this debate. And this was my personal cultural background for arguing for basic income. Coming back to lone mothers, if you look at the 7 principles of Nancy Fraser, one important principle is, in fact, women should have an income. Income equality for women means, because they do a lot of work for their children, means an income which not only is enough for the woman, but also for the child. It's das Kind an der Hand der Mutter should be provided for. And Jane and I started comparative research on lone mother regimes in in the Western world, and it's very interesting. If you take the position of the lone mother, you don't get the Nordic cluster. You don't get it. Lone mothers in Sweden, due to full employment all the time, are very time poor, in contrast to the men. Whereas up to Tony Blair's New Labour, the British welfare state was very much based on poverty and especially on lone mothers. Like the Irish one, it's always the fighting revolutionary man who's not at home, so the women have to be provided for. And so you have very different clusters of lone mother welfare regimes in the Western world. I stop here. I could talk
I
about
think there's a lot for the coffee break, I think, that we can pick up on. And give David very quickly
like to say something to this briefly on commodification. There's a class-specific element to this. Before there was Nancy Fraser, there was Catherine McKinnon, who initially, of course, began by attacking Marx's position on protective legislation in the mines. That commodification freed women from domestic servitude. And that argument was very appealing to, how should I put it, middle-class women who had professional opportunities, less appealing to those who relied on protective legislation in their lives. So there's a class-specific element to this. And I would ask you, there is also, you sort of conflated income and asset construction. And one of the things, particularly in the United States with its high levels of inequality, is that you mentioned so-called baby bonds, that the government would deposit a certain amount of money in the birth of a child and it would stay there and collect interest for 18 years or whatever. This is advocated by African Americans more than anybody else because the disproportion in asset possession is much more troublesome than the disproportion in income earning, which can be remedied through civil rights and other kinds of affirmative action and other programs of that sort. But asset construction is a long-term problem and requires a different kind of approach.
Thank you very much. Anke, the final statement.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you from the coffee break. I just say I'm very, very pleased that this panel focused so much on the role of women, because I think that is really the future discussion and we should take it from here. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And a lot of food also for discussion.